He'd been sitting there for 47 minutes, blind, alone, holding yellow flowers for a woman gone 3 years. Not one person stopped, not in a town where he'd spent 40 years teaching their children, coaching their teams, running their food drives. Nobody. Then the sound started, low and distant at first. Building, 50 motorcycles rolling to a stop on a wet Tennessee street, engines going quiet one by one. The man in the leather cut crouched down to his level. "You all right, sir?" Arthur couldn't see the patches, couldn't see the tattoos or the road-hardened faces looking at him. What he felt was the first kindness anyone had offered in 47 minutes, and it came from exactly the people no one expected. The weight of silence. Arthur Calloway had been sitting on the wooden bench at the corner of Maple Street and Route 9 for 47 minutes before he finally allowed himself to cry. He hadn't intended to cry. At 78, Arthur had lived long enough to know that crying in public was the kind of thing that attracted a particular brand of pity. The hollow kind, where strangers slowed just long enough to confirm they didn't want to get involved, and then sped up again, quietly relieved. He had witnessed it happen to others, back when his eyes still worked. Back when he could take in the full picture of the world, its colors, its angles, its distances, the complicated grammar of other people's faces. That was 3 years ago, before the glaucoma had narrowed everything down to a corridor of grey, and then, gradually, to nothing. Now he sat with his white oak cane gripped between both hands, head bowed, the smell of wet asphalt and exhaust mixing with something sweet drifting from the burger place across the street, and let the tears come anyway. The October afternoon in Harlow Creek pressed down on the chest like a flat iron, overcast, heavy with moisture that hadn't quite decided to become rain, the light already thinning toward evening, though it was barely past 4 o'clock. The number 7 bus had let him off 47 minutes ago, or what Arthur had believed was the number 7. He had counted the stops the way his daughter-in-law had taught him, back when the sight was still there, but failing, tapping his thumb against his knee for each one. 1, 2, 3, 4. Get off at 4. But he hadn't accounted for the express stop the driver had skipped on a hunch, and now Arthur was at Maple and Route 9 instead of Maple and Clement, and Cedar Hill Cemetery, where Eleanor was buried, was 12 blocks away, and he had no phone, because the screen had cracked 2 weeks ago, and the replacement hadn't arrived, and his son lived in Nashville, and today was the 3rd of October. It was always the 3rd of October. Eleanor Grace Calloway had died 3 years ago today, the same autumn that had finally taken Arthur's sight, as though grief and blindness had conspired together to remake him into something smaller and more helpless than he had ever imagined becoming. She had been 74, sharp as a tack until the very end, the kind of woman who corrected crossword clues in ink and never apologized for it, who remembered every student's name Arthur had brought home for dinner over the decades, who made decisions quickly and stuck with them, and who had once told him, with that blunt tenderness she kept for private moments, that he was the best decision she had ever made. They had been married for 51 years. He still reached for her side of the bed in the mornings. Every year on the 3rd of October, Arthur made the trip to Cedar Hill Cemetery to leave yellow chrysanthemums, her favorite, at her grave. He would sit on the small iron bench beside her headstone and talk for a while. He didn't believe in anything mystical. He was a retired English teacher, a pragmatist at heart, a man who had spent 4 decades teaching students that literature mattered because it was true, not because it was magic. But talking to Eleanor at her grave made the world feel less like a room where all the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. He had the chrysanthemums in his lap now, wrapped in brown paper from the flower shop on Clement, still faintly damp from the morning's drizzle. He could smell them, that particular herbal sweetness that had always been Eleanor to him before Eleanor herself was gone. He gripped them tighter. Around him, Harlow Creek moved with the indifference of a Thursday afternoon. Tires hissed on the wet road. A woman's voice clipped sharp into a phone somewhere behind him and then receded. A car door slammed. A bus, the wrong direction, the wrong number, rumbled past without stopping, and the displaced air struck Arthur in the face like a cold, open hand. He had tried in the first 20 minutes to ask for help. He'd turned toward the sound of footsteps and said carefully, "Excuse me, I'm sorry to bother you, but could you tell me how to reach Clement Street?" 3 times, in his best classroom voice, measured, non-threatening, the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime putting people at ease. The first person had not responded at all. He had heard their footsteps quicken. The second had said, "Sorry, I'm in a hurry," without breaking stride. The third, a teenager from the sound of the voice, had said, "I don't know, man," and kept walking. After the third attempt, Arthur had folded his hands around the top of his cane and stopped asking. It wasn't bitterness exactly. It was more like recognition. He had lived in Harlow Creek for 40 years, had taught hundreds of its children how to read and write and think, had coached a little league team for 12 summers, had run the annual holiday food drive at First Methodist for 2 decades. He had been, for most of his long life, a visible and valued person in this town. Now, on a bench with a white cane and no eyes to meet, he had become invisible. He understood that now in a way that no amount of empathy or imagination had prepared him for. Not the invisibility of being disliked, but the worse kind. The invisibility of being inconvenient. He pressed the back of his hand to his eyes. The chrysanthemums smelled like Eleanor. He cried quietly, the way a man cries when he has finally stopped being ashamed of needing to. Not a performance, not a plea, just the slow, honest leak of it, tears tracing the deep lines of his face, dropping into the collar of his coat. He didn't hear them at first. The sound built gradually, the way a storm builds in from the west, a low vibration that was too steady and too rhythmic to be weather. It grew in stages, a murmur, a rumble, a full-throated roar that filled the street from wall to wall. Motorcycles, dozens of them. He didn't lift his head. There was no longer any reason for him to lift his head. But the sound changed. Instead of passing through, it slowed. The roar dropped to a low collective idle, then lower still. And then, one by one, engine after engine went quiet, until the air at the corner of Maple and Route 9 was nearly still, punctuated only by the tick of cooling metal and the distant sigh of traffic beyond. Heavy boots on wet asphalt, deliberate, unhurried. Arthur sat very still. "Hey," said a voice. Low and careful, the specific kind of voice that knew how to hold both size and gentleness at once. "You all right, sir?" Arthur Calloway raised his head for the first time in 20 minutes. "No," he said, with the honesty of a man who had finally run out of reasons not to be honest. "I don't think I am." 50 pairs of eyes. Frank Mercer had been riding since he was 19 years old. In 35 years of road, he had seen most of what asphalt and weather and human nature had to offer. He had crossed 16 states in a single run. He had buried 3 brothers from the chapter and attended the funerals of 2 more who left the life before the road claimed them. He had made a particular peace with the reputation that followed him and his chapter everywhere they went. The stairs at gas stations, the locked car doors in parking lots, the mothers who pulled children close at crosswalks when the column rolled past, the police cruisers that ran plates before offering so much as a nod. He was used to being the wrong kind of person in the room. What he was not used to was being the first one to stop. They had been 2 hours out of Knoxville, heading west on Route 9 toward Memphis, a tribute run they made every October, rolling in memory of chapter members who had died over the years, 50 riders. Frank led from the front, as always, his chin slightly raised, reading the road the way a man reads a language he has spoken his whole life, fluently, without translation, with the kind of full-body attention that left no room for distraction. He had seen Arthur from 100 yards out. An old man on a bench at the corner of Maple in the rain, shoulders curved inward, head down, nothing remarkable at first distance. People sat at bus stops in the rain. But something about the particular geometry of the man's posture, the specific collapse of it, the way his hands gripped his cane like it was the last fixed point in a world that had come loose, hooked into something in Frank's chest that he couldn't immediately name. His right hand eased off the throttle. The column behind him adjusted, a gentle accordion of 50 machines responding to the subtle language of a man they trusted to know why he was slowing before he did. 15 feet from the bench, Frank saw the white cane. He saw the flowers. He saw, as he pulled to the curb and cut his engine, the tears on the old man's face. Behind him, the column followed without instruction, not because they knew why, because Frank had stopped. By the time Frank swung off the bike and removed his helmet, 49 other Hells Angels were doing the same, a slow, unhurried choreography of stillness that transformed the corner of Maple and Route 9 into something Harlow Creek had never hosted before and would not stop talking about for months afterward. Frank approached the bench the way you approach something fragile. Slowly, from the front, no sudden movements. "Hey," he said. "You all right, sir?" The old man raised his head. His eyes were open but moved slightly without fixing, tracking toward Frank's voice with a precision that told Frank, before the white cane had fully registered, exactly what he was looking at. "No," the man said. "I don't think I am." Frank crouched down to eye level, forearms on his knees, making himself as unthreatening as a man of his size and appearance could make himself. Up close, the man's face was a map of decades. Deep-cut lines, sun-weathered skin, the loose softness of great age. But underneath all of it was a structural dignity that reminded Frank, with a sharpness he hadn't expected, of someone he had not allowed himself to think about in years. "I'm Frank," he said. "What's your name?" "Arthur." A pause. "Arthur Calloway." "Arthur." Frank let the name sit. "Can you tell me what happened?" Behind him, Eddie Coleman, his sergeant-at-arms, a former Marine who had once described himself to a reporter as the reason the chapter didn't make bad decisions, whispered something to the rider beside him. Frank caught the word "lost," and then a settling quiet, the specific quiet of 50 large people collectively deciding to be small. Arthur Calloway told Frank about the bus, about the stop count, about the 3rd of October, and the cemetery and the chrysanthemums. His voice was steady at first, organized, precise, the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime structuring his thoughts before he spoke. But it thinned at the edges when he said Eleanor's name, and Frank didn't interrupt. He listened in the way he had learned to listen, fully, without preparing his next sentence. Across Route 9, Sandra Webb had come out of the Copper Cup diner with a dish towel over her shoulder and was standing on the sidewalk with her phone in her hand. She hadn't raised it. Her expression was working through something she hadn't finished processing. At the corner of Maple and 5th, Nate Holloway, on his way back from the hardware store, had stopped walking and was openly staring. He had his phone up and was filming, though he wasn't entirely sure why. A silver sedan slowed as it passed, then accelerated. 2 women on the opposite corner went quiet and watched. The entire moment was being observed from every vantage point except the one that mattered. Arthur Calloway couldn't see any of it. "Maple and Clement," Frank said when Arthur finished. "Cedar Hill." "That's right. 12 blocks, I think. I can't—" Arthur touched his coat pocket. "I don't have my phone. My son is in Nashville. I don't want to bother him for something like this." He said it the way proud old men said things that cost them, quickly, looking away from what they meant. "You're not bothering anyone, Arthur," Frank said. He stood and turned to look at his column. 49 men and women in road leather, spread across the curb and the lane beside it, watching him with the patient attention of people who had learned that Frank Mercer didn't stop for no reason. He knew every one of their faces, knew which ones had done time and which hadn't. knew which ones had children who didn't call, and which ones had parents who were gone, and which ones cried in private over things they'd never acknowledge in daylight. He looked at Eddie. Eddie gave him the smallest nod. Frank turned back to Arthur Calloway. "We're going to take you to Cedar Hill," he said, "if that's all right with you." Arthur was quiet for a moment. His hands tightened on the cane, then relaxed, then settled. He turned his face toward the sound of Frank's voice with a precision that Frank would later describe, to anyone who asked, as the most direct eye contact he had ever received from a man who could not see. "I'd be grateful," Arthur said. It was precisely at that moment that Officer Roy Tanner's patrol car turned onto Maple Street. The wall between names. Roy Tanner had been a Harlow Creek police officer for 11 years, and in those 11 years he had developed a working theory about scenes. The more motorcycles present, the more paperwork that followed. He told himself he had nothing personal against bikers. He told himself that regularly, but 50 of them parked on a corner, surrounding an elderly man. That was a call-in situation regardless of how you arranged it, and 3 residents had called it in inside of 7 minutes. He stepped out of the cruiser with the measured blankness he had practiced into a kind of professional mask and surveyed the corner. The bikes, the cuts, the patches, the insignia he recognized without effort. Hell's Angels. Full chapter. He identified the president's patch on the tall man crouching at the bench before anything else registered. "Afternoon," he said, addressing the air between the group and the old man. "Everything all right here?" "Everything's fine," the tall man said. His tone was level, not cold, not warm, calibrated with the precision of a man who had answered that question from law enforcement for a long time and had learned exactly which gear didn't make things worse. "Sir?" Tanner addressed Arthur directly. "Are you here voluntarily?" Arthur turned toward Tanner's voice. "I am," he said, with the patient clarity of a man who had spent a career speaking to rooms full of people who weren't paying attention. "These men offered to help me reach my wife's grave. It's the anniversary of her death. I'd appreciate it if you'd let them do that." Roy Tanner was trained to read situations, and what he was reading now was making him uncomfortable in ways he hadn't entirely catalogued. The old man was calm, clear-headed, unafraid. The 50 bikers were doing nothing that warranted intervention, no posturing, no confrontation, no crowding the bench. Several of them had actually stepped back, creating more space around Arthur rather than less. "There have been calls," Tanner said more quietly. "Residents concerned about the gathering." "We're parked legally," Frank said, still level. "I can see that." The silence between them developed a texture. It was Sandra Webb who broke it. She had made her decision on the sidewalk outside the Copper Cup. Frank watched her cross Route 9 at a brisk walk, dish towel still over her shoulder, and come to a stop near the bench. "Arthur Calloway," she said, leaning slightly toward him. "Is that you?" Arthur turned. "Sandra? Lord." She touched her chest. "I didn't recognize you at first with all the—" She stopped herself and changed course. "Can I bring you some coffee? You've been out here in the cold." "I'd appreciate that, Sandra, thank you." She looked at Frank, then at the wall of leather and chrome arranged along the curb, then back at Arthur, who sat with his flowers in his lap and his cane between his hands, and the particular stillness of a man who had learned to wait without agitation. Something shifted in her face. The thing she hadn't finished processing on the sidewalk finished itself. "Can I bring anything out for—" She hesitated on the threshold of the question, then stepped through it. "For anyone else?" "We're all right, ma'am," Frank said. "Thank you." She gave a firm, single nod and went back across the street. Tanner watched her go, then looked at Frank with an expression that had opened slightly along its seams. Nate Holloway had kept filming from the corner. He had moved from passive documentation to something more deliberate, framing individual faces, the old man's hands on his cane, the patches on the vests, the wet asphalt reflecting the grey sky. He wasn't sure what story he was capturing. He had the specific feeling that he would understand it better in retrospect. Frank was the one who ended the standoff. Not because he owed Tanner anything, but because Arthur deserved to get to the cemetery before the light was completely gone. "His wife died 3 years ago today," Frank said, pitching his voice low enough that it travelled only to Tanner. "He got off at the wrong bus stop, sat here by himself for almost an hour. He let that land. Nobody stopped. We stopped." Roy Tanner looked at Arthur Calloway, at the chrysanthemums, at the white cane, at the face of a man who had been sitting in the cold and the wet, invisible, for 47 minutes, in a town where he had spent 4 decades doing visible, valued things. Tanner looked at Frank. "You know Cedar Hill?" Tanner said. "I'll find it. Route 9 south, left on Clement, 2nd left on Millbrook. Cemetery's on the right." A pause that contained a decision being made. "I'll run ahead and hold the Clement intersection." Frank held the officer's eyes for a moment. "Thank you, officer." Tanner nodded, the practiced, minimal nod of a man who didn't want to make a production of it, and went back to his cruiser. Eddie Coleman materialized at Frank's shoulder. He was holding a bottle of water and a small bag of crackers from someone's saddlebag. "For Arthur," he said, "case he's hungry." Frank looked at him. Eddie shrugged his considerable shoulders with the unconvincing nonchalance of a 300-pound former Marine who had been caught doing something kind. "What?" "Nothing," Frank said. "Nothing at all." He turned back to the bench. "Arthur, you ready?" Arthur stood in the careful, deliberate way of a man who had learned to negotiate with his own body, unfolding slowly, cane finding the ground first, weight shifting with measured trust. He tucked the chrysanthemums under his left arm and turned his face toward Frank's voice. "I've never been on a motorcycle," he said. "First time for everything," Frank said. Something eased around Arthur's eyes, not quite a smile, but the structural precursor to one. "Eleanor always said I was too cautious," he said. "She would have considered this overdue." Frank laughed, a short, genuine sound that surprised him slightly. "Then let's show her she was right." The procession. Getting Arthur Calloway onto a Hells Angels motorcycle required the combined logistical intelligence of Frank Mercer, Eddie Coleman, and a quiet woman named Terry Raines, who rode a black Road King and had 14 years of nursing behind her before she joined the chapter, along with the cooperative dignity of Arthur himself, who followed every instruction precisely and without complaint. "Left foot on the peg first," Terry told him, "both hands on his shoulders." "Not the jacket, the shoulders. Feel the difference." Arthur felt the difference. "When the bike moves, lean with it, not against it, with it." "Like dancing," Arthur said. Terry paused. "Exactly like dancing. I used to be better at that than I am now." "You'll do fine," she said, and her tone was clinical enough to be reassuring. The chrysanthemums went into a canvas bag that Big Andy, 6'4", knuckles tattooed, father of 4 daughters, produced from his saddlebag and offered without comment. Arthur's other belongings were secured in a side compartment by Eddie, who handled them with more care than he brought to most things. The column formed with the ease of long practice, 2 riders to the front, the main body behind Frank and Arthur, Terry and Eddie flanking. 50 machines, in a formation that Harlow Creek Route 9 had never seen and might not see again. Frank kept the throttle smooth and the speed deliberate, no sharp acceleration, no hard cornering, and he felt Arthur adjust behind him in stages, the old man's grip on his shoulders shifting from uncertain to attentive, as the miles of instinct in Frank's hands translated through the machine into something Arthur's body could read. "All right back there?" Frank called. "Surprisingly," Arthur called back, and there was something in his voice that Frank recognized as the specific surprise of finding that a feared thing was not what you expected. Lighter, somehow, more navigable. Ahead, at Clement Street, Officer Roy Tanner had done exactly what he'd said he would do. His cruiser sat crosswise in the intersection, light bar turning blue and red in the flat October air, holding traffic back from both directions. As the column came through, Frank watched Tanner in his peripheral vision. The officer stood beside his door with his radio in one hand, and as Frank passed, he lifted his chin. Not quite a salute, but close enough to one that the shape of it was unmistakable. Harlow Creek watched. That was the thing about 50 motorcycles. They were constitutionally impossible to ignore. Shopkeepers came to the glass fronts of their stores. A man walking a retriever stopped and stood with the leash slack in his hand. 3 boys on bicycles coasted to a halt at the corner of Millbrook, mouths open. A woman on her front porch shielded her eyes against the thin horizontal light and watched the column roll past, and her face moved through 3 distinct expressions in the space of 5 seconds. Alarm, confusion, and then something that hadn't yet finished becoming what it was. Nate Holloway, who had gotten in his truck and followed at a distance, filmed it all. He drove with one hand and his phone mounted on the dash, and he wasn't thinking about any of the things he usually thought about when he took out his phone. He was thinking about his mother, who had been a student in Arthur Calloway's freshman English class in 1987, and who still kept a paperback of The Great Gatsby on her nightstand, because Mr. Calloway had told her it was about the lies we tell ourselves, and she had never forgotten it. He was thinking about the 47 minutes Arthur had sat at that bus stop. He was thinking about the fact that he himself had driven past that corner at 3:20 that afternoon and had not stopped. He had not even slowed. The motorcycles had. Cedar Hill Cemetery sat behind a low stone wall off Millbrook Road, the iron main gate standing open as it always did, year-round. Frank brought the column through single file, navigating the narrow cemetery lane at walking speed, and the sound of 50 machines dropping to near silence inside those walls was a different kind of quiet than any of them had made before. "Third lane in," Arthur said. His voice had changed, purposeful now, the grief still present, but organized into something he could walk with. 50 feet. She's near the oak on the left. There's an iron bench beside her stone. Frank found it without difficulty. A modest granite headstone, Eleanor Grace Calloway, 1948-2023, and beside it, exactly as described, a small wrought iron bench. He helped Arthur dismount with the same hands Arthur had learned to trust over the past 40 minutes. Terry placed the canvas bag in Arthur's arms. Arthur reached in and drew out the chrysanthemums, straightening the brown paper wrapping with the automatic care of a man who had done this before. He walked to the headstone without hesitation, his cane finding the bench, using it as a fixed reference point, turning until the stone was in front of him. He crouched slowly and laid the flowers at its base with both hands, smoothing a corner of the paper that had folded in the bag, adjusting them with a particularity that had nothing to do with how they looked and everything to do with something else entirely. He stayed crouched for a moment. Then he stood and began to talk, not loudly. But the cemetery was still enough that the words carried. He told Eleanor about the year, the new chair in the living room he kept meaning to replace, because it wasn't as comfortable as the old one. The tomatoes Shirley had grown and left on his porch in September, better than anything from the store, which Eleanor would have found deeply satisfying as a point of principle. He told her that Michael had called every Sunday without fail, which he knew she'd be glad to hear, because she'd always worried that distance would become an excuse. He told her about the bus stop. "I got lost," he said. "Made a mess of the stop count. Sat there for the better part of an hour, feeling sorry for myself." A pause, and in the pause the October air moved through the oak's remaining leaves. And then the most unexpected people came along. His hand found the top of the headstone. Rested there, the specific touch of someone placing their hand on a surface they know better than they know their own. Behind him, 50 Hell's Angels stood between the headstones of Harlow Creek's dead in the grey October light and did not make a sound. Frank stood 30 feet back. He was aware that his throat had tightened in a way he had not anticipated. Eddie appeared at his left shoulder. Neither of them spoke. They had buried people they loved in places like this. They both understood what it cost to be left. After several minutes, Arthur turned, and even without functioning eyes, he turned toward the group, toward the collective warmth of 50 people breathing, the subtle pressure of that much human presence in the cooling air. He turned toward them the way a plant turns toward a light it can feel, but not see. "Thank you," he said. Not to Frank specifically, to all of them. "I've been a teacher my whole life, and I don't have the right words." "You don't need them," Frank said. The road they left behind. They took Arthur home. It was Frank's suggestion, and it became the chapter's unanimous agreement before he finished making it. One of those decisions that exists before it is spoken, because the alternative is simply not something anyone assembled is willing to consider. Arthur navigated from the back of the motorcycle by sound and memory, calling out turns with growing confidence. The compressor unit behind Harlow Creek Pharmacy, the specific gravel pitch of the Methodist Church parking lot, and finally, 2 houses before his own, the sound of a wind chime turning on a covered porch, placed there last spring by Shirley Thompson, because she had decided that Arthur needed something to tell him when the weather was changing. "There," Arthur said. "The chime." Frank pulled into the driveway on Birchwood Lane. Behind him, 50 motorcycles arranged themselves along the residential street with a tidiness that would become, in the retelling, one of the most commented upon details of the entire afternoon. Shirley Thompson came out of her house before the engines had finished cooling. She stood on her porch steps with her arms wrapped across her chest, watching. When she saw Arthur step down from the motorcycle, with Terry's steady hand guiding him, his foot finding the driveway, his cane locating the ground, her hands went to her face. She came across the lawn faster than 70 years usually carried her. "Arthur Calloway," she said, and her voice had that specific quality of someone who has been frightened and is now converting it directly into forward motion. "Your son has been calling me for 2 hours. I was 20 minutes away from calling Roy Tanner." "Roy's had a full afternoon already," Arthur said calmly. Shirley looked at the column of motorcycles on her street, at Frank, at Big Andy, who was holding Arthur's canvas bag at his side with the careful posture of a man who had been entrusted with something and intended to return it properly. "Who are all these people?" she asked. "Friends," Arthur said. Then, after a considered pause, with the precision of a man who had always used language deliberately, "New friends." Shirley received the bag from Big Andy with a nod and looked at Frank for a long, assessing moment. Frank looked back. Whatever calculation she was running reached its conclusion. "I'm putting the kettle on," she said. "If any of you—" "We need to get back on the road," Frank said. "But thank you, Mom, genuinely." She gave him the kind of nod that contained a revised opinion. Frank turned to Arthur, who had found his footing on the driveway and stood with his cane and his quiet face tilted slightly toward the sky. The particular posture he had, Frank had noticed, of offering more of his face to the world in compensation for the eyes that no longer gathered it. "Arthur," Frank said. "Frank," Arthur said. The pause between them had room in it. Neither man was in a hurry to close it. "Why did you stop?" Arthur asked, not challenging, genuinely curious, with the particular quality of a teacher's question, the kind that assumes a real answer exists. Frank thought about the easy version first. Then he set it aside. "I had a father who went blind," he said. "Not from birth. It came on slowly, the same way yours probably did. I was 17 when it got bad." He let a breath out. "There was a period when I wasn't there for him the way I should have been. I was too young, too angry at everything, too convinced that what was happening to him was somehow also happening to me to see it clearly. I wasn't there when he needed someone to stop. He paused. I've been trying to pay that back ever since, probably in the wrong currency most of the time. Arthur stood quietly in the driveway of his small house, while the October light went thin and lateral around them. "You weren't in the wrong currency today," he said. Frank nodded once. Arthur extended his hand toward the sound of Frank's presence, and Frank took it. A firm, unhurried handshake, the kind that means what it means. "Ride safe," Arthur said. "I always do," Frank said, which wasn't entirely true, but which felt like the right thing to say to a man who had just spent an afternoon reminding him what arriving safely actually meant. Nate Holloway posted his footage at 6:47 that evening. He hadn't planned to edit it. He'd sat in his truck in his own driveway after following the column back to Birchwood Lane, watched the bikers roll out 2 by 2 into the Harlow Creek dusk, and then sat for another 10 minutes with the engine off, not entirely sure what he was feeling or why. He'd watched the footage back twice. He'd titled it exactly what it was. Blind elderly man was crying alone at a bus stop. Then 50 Hells Angels pulled up. He'd written 3 sentences as a caption, because 3 was all it needed. By midnight, it had been viewed 400,000 times. By morning, 2 million. Roy Tanner saw it at his kitchen table over coffee and sat there after it ended with his mug going cold in his hands, thinking about the specific sequence of his own afternoon. The hand that had gone to his belt when he stepped out of the cruiser. The automatic cataloguing of threats, the length of time it had taken him to move from that first assessment to holding the intersection at Clement Street with his lights on. He thought about the gap between those 2 moments. Thought about what it was made of. Too long, he thought. Then, but not forever. Sandra Webb watched it 3 times from behind the copper cup counter with her phone propped against the napkin holder and thought about the dish towel she'd still been holding when she'd finally crossed the street. She liked to think of herself as someone who helped. She had never quite tracked, until that Thursday afternoon, the difference between the person she believed herself to be and the person who had stood on the sidewalk with a phone in her hand for 12 minutes before she moved. Arthur's son drove up from Nashville that Saturday. He and Arthur sat at the kitchen table and watched Nate's footage on a laptop. When it ended, neither of them spoke for a while. Outside, the wind chime turned in the November air. "You should have called me," Michael said. "I know." "Dad, you're not a bother. You will never be a bother. I need you to decide that before you decide not to call." Arthur was quiet. His hands were flat on the table, that absolute stillness of his. "Your mother used to say the same thing," he said finally. "I'm her son." "She would have been mortified that I got lost," Arthur said. "She would have made me rehearse the route 50 times. She would have loved those bikers. I told her about them." He touched the table surface, a small and private gesture. "At the grave, before I knew anyone was listening." Michael looked at his father, at the white hair and the lined face and the eyes that no longer tracked, but still somehow conveyed the quality of a man who saw things with unusual clarity. "What did they do?" Michael asked. "When you were talking to her?" "Nothing," Arthur said. "They just let me talk." A week after the footage went viral, the Harlow Creek Gazette reached Frank Mercer by phone. The chapter was 4 states west by then. The reporter asked what had made him stop. Frank thought about how to say it without making a speech. "People look at us and see what they expect to see," he said. "We do the same thing to other people. Man on a bench in the rain. Not my world, not my kind of person, not my problem." 50 people walked past Arthur Calloway that afternoon and kept walking, because that's the calculation they ran, and it came up the same every time. A pause. "We stopped because somebody had to. That's the whole of it." "Do you think the reaction would have been different if someone else had stopped?" the reporter asked. Frank was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "I do. If it had been the expected kind of person, people would have felt good about the world and gone on with their day. Because it was us, they had to actually reckon with it. Figure out why what they thought they knew and what actually happened didn't line up. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with." He paused. "But I think it might be a useful one." The reporter asked if he'd stayed in touch with Arthur. Frank said Shirley Thompson had exchanged numbers on both their behalfs and appointed herself communications director without being asked. He said he'd called once from somewhere in Arkansas, and they'd talked for 20 minutes about Eleanor, and about Frank's father, and about a novel Arthur had mentioned that Frank admitted he had never read. "He said he'd quiz me on it next time," Frank said, and the reporter noted the smile it carried without being able to see it. "So I've got homework now." On the 3rd of October the following year, a card arrived at the house on Birchwood Lane. The postmark was Denver, Colorado. The handwriting inside was large and clear. Terry Raines, it turned out, who had reasoned that large print was the practical choice without making an issue of it. "Thinking of you and Eleanor today. Hope the chrysanthemums were yellow." They had been. They always were. Shirley read the card to Arthur twice, standing in the kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window over the sink. Arthur asked her to read it a third time. Then he set it on the counter by the telephone and stood in his quiet house on his quiet street and felt, without question or ambiguity, the pressure of the world against the walls. Vast, complicated, reliably indifferent, and occasionally, in the moments that counted most, capable of something that defied every expectation he had been given reason to hold. He was not invisible. He had never truly been invisible. It had taken 50 people in road leather to remind a town, and if he was being honest with himself, occasionally Arthur Calloway too, that the world's first impression of a person and the truth of that person were two different things, and the distance between them was exactly where the most important stories lived.